Henry Hawthorne laid the physician's bill beside the marriage settlement and said, "Sign Miss Gresham or your mother goes back to the debtor's ward tonight." Across the firelit drawing room, Humphrey, Duke of Penhallow, sat in his carved, wheeled chair. He took Grace's shaking hand and placed white roses in her lap, as if she were the one being honored. Grace did not understand why a man society called ruined would look at a bought bride with reverence, and she was too afraid to ask. The room was too warm, close, with wax-old paper and fear. Behind Humphrey's chair stood Fitzwilliam Pembroke, a retired colonel now acting as solicitor, his face as unreadable as polished stone. In the far corner, Grace's mother sat wrapped in a thin shawl, her breathing shallow and uneven. That breath was the whole price of Grace's life. Grace looked down at the bouquet. White roses, perfect petals, a heavy white silk ribbon tied around the stems. It looked less like a wedding gift than a decoration for a sacrifice. She was 23. She had spent 3 years counting pennies for bread coal and apothecaries who lowered their voices at the door. Now she was measuring out the rest of her life in ink. Hawthorne tapped the parchment. "Your mother has taken enough mercy from me," he said. "You will not find another offer so generous." Grace's fingers tightened around the roses until one thorn pricked her glove. "Breathe. Keep the spine straight. Do not let him see the terror." She reached for the quill. The feather trembled against her knuckles. She pressed the nib to the paper and signed. Grace Gresham. The scratching sound seemed louder than the fire, louder than her mother's breath, louder than the silence of the Duke watching her. It was done. She was sold. She braced for the Duke to pull his hand away, for Hawthorne to laugh, for the invisible collar to snap shut around her throat. Instead, Humphrey's fingers tightened slightly over hers. His hand was warm, strong. "Mr. Hawthorne," Humphrey said. His voice was not loud, but it held the cold, exact weight of command. "You have your settlement. You are dismissed from my house." Hawthorne bristled. "Your Grace!" "I hardly think." Humphrey looked at him. That was all. The pale, flat stare stopped Hawthorne's words. The creditor bowed stiffly, gathered his papers, and left the room with the expression of a man who had expected profit and discovered humiliation instead. When the door clicked shut, Humphrey turned back to Grace. He did not look at her threadbare hem or the ink drying on her fingers. He looked directly into her eyes. "No one," he said softly, "will call you purchased in my house. Your Grace, your Grace." The title landed between them, heavy and strange. Grace drew her hand back slowly, clutching the white ribbon that trailed from the roses. She had expected to be a nursemaid in silk. A convenience, a quiet answer to a duke's loneliness. Why did he speak to her as if she had just conquered a nation? The ceremony took place the next morning, by special license in the parish church, before gray light had fully reached the windows. There were no crowds, no music, no wedding breakfast. Her mother sat in the front pew beneath Humphrey's cloak, coughing into a handkerchief. Colonel Pembroke stood as witness. Hawthorne did not attend. When Grace repeated the vows, her voice did not break. Humphrey's did not soften. But when the ring slid onto her finger, he held her hand 1 second longer than duty required, as if giving her time to believe she had not vanished beneath the bargain. 2 days later, the carriage wheels crunched against the gravel of Penhallow House. The estate was vast, a fortress of grey stone and tall windows that swallowed the Lancashire sky. Grace stepped down with one small trunk, one borrowed cloak, and the white silk ribbon she had untied from the dead roses and slipped into her pocket. Humphrey owned the stone, the land, the servants lined along the steps, the marriage lines resting in his solicitor's vault. Grace owned a ribbon, a sick mother, and a name newly gilded by a title she had not earned. She waited for the demands. A bought bride had duties. A disabled duke, society whispered, would either be a tyrant or a child requiring a mother. She found neither. Humphrey's chair was brought up a discreet wooden ramp at the side entrance. In the grand hall, he did not issue demands for Grace's time. He issued orders for her dignity. "The Duchess will take the west suite," he told the housekeeper. "Mrs. Gresham will have the adjoining rooms. Send to Manchester for Dr. Erris. I want him here by Tuesday to examine her lungs." Then he turned his chair slightly toward Grace. "If the rooms do not suit you, madam, you have only to say it." Grace stood perfectly still. "They are more than sufficient, Your Grace. Thank you." "You do not need to thank me for what belongs to you." He gave a brief nod and moved down the long corridor. Grace watched him go. The servants watched her. For one sharp moment, she understood that she did not know how to stand in her own house. Grace spent the first week waiting for the kindness to turn into a bill. The servants addressed her with deep curtsies. The west suite was filled with light and new fires. Her mother was given broth, clean linens, and hot water for steam whenever her chest tightened. Dr. Erris arrived from Manchester with a leather case and a grave, practical manner. He did not promise miracles. That made Grace trust him more. By the 5th day, color had returned to Mrs. Gresham's cheeks. Grace should have rested. She could not. Every fire lit in her grate, every bow from a footman, every silver tray placed before her, felt like another coin added to a ledger she could never repay. She did not know how to be a duchess. She only knew how to survive. So she found her anchor in work. Before the debts had consumed them, Grace had taken in fine linen work and organized 3 women from their old parish to sew for wealthier households. It had barely kept the debtors' ward at bay, but it had taught her figures, orders, and which merchants cheated women because they thought hunger could not count. Now she wanted to build the thing properly. A convalescent needlework room. A place where women with weak lungs, injured hands, or fragile bodies could earn an honest wage without begging for parish pity. She sat in the morning room with a heavy ledger open before her. The white silk ribbon from her bridal bouquet marked the page where she calculated thread wages, beeswax candles, and the cost of good Belfast linen. Humphrey's chair moved silently over the thick carpets. The house had been altered for him, ramps hidden behind carved screens, thresholds smoothed, certain doors widened. But the world inside the house had not altered nearly enough. Visitors came, the vicar, the neighboring squires, a baronet's wife with a sugary voice and wandering eyes. They spoke to Humphrey loudly, as if his legs had taken his hearing. They looked over his shoulder to Pembroke when discussing estate matters. They offered him pity dressed as reverence. "Such a trial, Your Grace," the vicar murmured one afternoon, glancing at the wheeled chair. "But Providence gives burdens to the strong." Humphrey's jaw tightened. His face became cold, polite stone. "Indeed, vicar. Will you take tea?" He never complained. He never snapped. He simply built a wall of ice between himself and the room. Grace knew walls. She had lived behind one made of silence for years. On Thursday, Jacquetta Thorne arrived. Jacquetta was Humphrey's cousin, a widow wrapped in plum silk, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She sat in the drawing room, sipping tea, her gaze moving over Grace as if assessing whether a chair had been upholstered above its proper value. "Well," Jacquetta said, "you have certainly settled in, Grace. I confess when I heard Humphrey had married Hawthorne's little debtor, I feared the house would smell of boiled cabbage. But you clean up rather well. A pretty mercy project for my cousin. Grace's hands went still in her lap. The old humiliation flared. Do not flinch. Do not give her the victory. Before Grace could speak, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Humphrey rolled his chair forward, smooth and silent. He stopped directly between Jacquetta and Grace. Jacquetta, you will address the Duchess of Penhallow by her title, and if you ever refer to my wife as a project again, you will find the gates of this estate permanently locked to your carriage. Do I make myself understood? Jacquetta flushed. I meant no offense. You offered it very plainly. She stammered an apology and called for her carriage shortly after. When they were alone, Grace looked at Humphrey's broad back. You did not have to do that, Your Grace. He turned the chair slowly. His eyes were flint. I will not have you insulted in this house. It was protection, but it was cold. A king defending a boundary, a duke defending his name, perhaps even a husband defending his property. Grace touched the white ribbon hidden in her pocket. She wanted to thank him, but gratitude felt dangerous. Too close to debt. Too close to a chain. The change came on a rainy Tuesday. Humphrey was moving from the library to the conservatory when a heavy Turkish rug, bunched by a careless footman, caught the front wheel of his chair. The chair jerked hard. Humphrey gripped the armrests, his knuckles white beneath his gloves. 3 servants rushed forward. Your Grace, allow us— Step back, Humphrey snapped. The servants froze. Humphrey pushed at the wheel again. The rug held. He was trapped in the middle of his own house, surrounded by staring faces, his chest rising with controlled exertion. The humiliation in the corridor was a living thing. Grace had just stepped from the linen room. She saw the servants, the bunched wool, the white-hot shame burning behind Humphrey's cold mask. She did not rush to him. She did not gasp. She walked calmly to the edge of the rug, looked down at the fold, then lifted her gaze to his. She did not touch him. She did not touch the chair. May I move the rug, Your Grace? She asked. Humphrey stared at her. The rigid anger in his shoulders flickered. She had asked. She had given him the choice to accept help or refuse it. She had not treated him like furniture to be moved or a child to be rescued. At last he said very quietly, Yes. Grace knelt, smoothed the heavy wool flat, and stood back. Humphrey pushed the wheel. The chair glided forward. Thank you, he said, not looking at the servants. Of course, Grace replied. Then she walked past him toward the linen room, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. An hour later, the linen room door opened. Humphrey wheeled himself in. The room was practically filled with bolts of muslin, baskets of thread, and the clean smell of lavender sachets. Grace stood at the broad table, the ledger open, the white silk ribbon marking the page. Humphrey moved closer. Pembroke tells me you are requesting funds for 5 sewing tables and a shipment of Belfast linen. I am, Your Grace. For what purpose? There is a room in the east wing with good light. It is empty. I wish to use it. For guests. For women in the village who are ill or recovering, or too weak for mill work and field work. They can sew. I will oversee the orders. They will be paid properly. Humphrey looked at her for a long moment. Grace lifted her chin. I do not want your charity, Your Grace. I want an investment. The linen will sell in London if it is cut well and finished cleanly. I have done the figures. It can repay the first outlay within the year. Humphrey looked down at the ledger. The numbers were neat. Exact. Grace had counted every candle end and every inch of thread, because poverty had taught her that waste was a luxury with teeth. His gaze moved to the white ribbon. "You do not build a life for a duchess, Grace," he said. "You build a manufactory." "I build what I know," she answered softly. "A title does not keep the cold out. A wage does." Humphrey did not smile, but the hard line of his mouth eased. "Order 10 tables." Grace blinked. "If you are to build it," he said, "do not build it small." He turned his chair and left her alone with the linen. Grace let out a breath she had not known she was holding. He had not patronized her. He had seen the work, and he had treated it as real. That was the first kindness that did not feel like debt. The wall of ice around the Duke of Penhallow cracked 3 nights later. They attended a dinner party at a neighboring estate. Grace wore deep blue silk, her hair pinned with pearls that had belonged to Humphrey's grandmother. She played the serene duchess because she had always been good at standing straight while frightened. Humphrey sat at the head of the table in his chair. The conversation turned to the hunting season. Men spoke of hounds' fences and horses with the easy cruelty of those who did not notice who was being excluded. Jacquetta Thorne, who had somehow secured an invitation, smiled across the table. "It is such a shame Penhallow cannot ride this year," she said. "But I suppose every man finds a new pace eventually. Some collect horses, some collect chairs, crutches, and convenient brides to push them." Silence fell over the dining room. Grace looked at Humphrey. His face was carved marble. But beneath the table edge, she saw his hand grip the wheel rim so tightly the leather of his glove. The room waited to see whether he would bleed. Humphrey's voice dropped into the silence, like a blade. "I find a man's pace is measured by the company he manages to outrun. Jacquetta, you are falling behind." A nervous moved around the table. The moment passed. But Grace did not forget the sound of his glove against the wheel. When they returned to Penhallow House, Humphrey did not go to his bedchamber. He wheeled himself into the dark conservatory. Grace found him there an hour later. No candles were lit. Moonlight cut across the stone floor and turned the silver rims of his wheels pale. The air smelled of damp earth, fern leaves, and night-blooming jasmine. Grace did not ask whether he was well. He would have lied. Instead, she pulled a small iron chair from the corner and sat near him in the dark. For a long time, neither spoke. Before the carriage overturned, Humphrey said at last, his voice turned toward the black glass. "I was considered the finest shot in Lancashire. I danced until dawn. People did not look at me and see a tragedy. They saw power." His voice held no self-pity. That made it worse. "Now they look at me and measure my usefulness. They wonder if my mind is as broken as my spine. They praise my courage, which is merely their way of forgiving my presence in a room." He swallowed once. "I require order, because if I allow a single crack in the discipline, they will reduce me to an infant." The words settled between them. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out the white silk ribbon. She laid it on the small table between them. "They look at you," she said, "and they see furniture." Humphrey turned his head. Grace looked at the ribbon. "I know the feeling." His silence changed. "They looked at me and saw a ledger," she continued. "A debt to be traded. Hawthorne saw a sum of money. Jacquetta sees a servant wearing silk." Her voice stayed steady, though every word cost her. "You built a fortress of rules to keep them from pitying you. But the rules do not keep you warm, Your Grace. They only keep you alone." Humphrey stared at her. The cold, impenetrable Duke was gone. In his place was a man who had not been touched without medical purpose in 3 years. "You made rules so no one could pity you," Grace said. But rules cannot hold your hand when you are tired. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Humphrey reached across the small space. His large, warm hand covered hers on the table. "Who holds your hand, Grace?" he asked. "When you are tired?" The question bypassed every defense she had. It slipped beneath the composed obedience, beneath the perfect posture, beneath the habit of being useful, because usefulness was safer than need. Grace's throat closed. "No one," she said, her voice once. "I am so tired, Humphrey. I am tired of being brave for my mother. I am tired of being grateful for every scrap of air I am permitted to breathe. I am tired of standing perfectly straight because if I bend, they will say I belong in the gutter." She did not sob, but one tear spilled over her lashes and fell hot onto the back of his hand. Humphrey did not offer a sermon. He did not promise that no one would ever hurt her again. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. He held on. In the dark conservatory, among cold stone and sleeping flowers, he let her be exhausted. He let her be entirely unbrave. And Grace, who had been bought to save a life, began to wonder if she had also been seen. The next morning, the fragile peace shattered. Hawthorne's letter arrived by messenger. Grace read it in the library while the rain tapped against the windows. "Your Grace, it appears the physician's final account was miscalculated. An oversight on my part. A sum of £400 remains. I would hate to interrupt the county assembly tomorrow by reminding the ton that the new Duchess of Penhallow was a bride bought for a sickbed bargain. Persuade your husband to settle the sum, or I will speak the truth of your purchase in the public square." Grace read the letter twice. The blood drained from her face. It was extortion. Worse, it was a threat to Humphrey. He was already whispered about. If Hawthorne stood before the assembly rooms and declared that the Duke had bought a desperate woman to warm his bed, pity would turn to revulsion. Jacquetta's poison would become public truth. Humphrey's guarded dignity would be dragged across the cobbles. Grace folded the letter. The familiar cold panic settled over her. Calculate the cost. Survive. She went to her rooms and pulled a small leather satchel from the wardrobe. She packed 2 plain dresses, a shawl, and the little purse that held the few coins she still considered her own. She could go to Manchester. If she vanished before the assembly, Hawthorne would have no proper target. The scandal of a runaway wife would burn hot and brief. The scandal of a bought bride would stain Humphrey forever. Her mother would remain safe. Grace knew that with a certainty deeper than fear. Humphrey would never cast a sick woman from warm rooms because her daughter had caused him pain. That left only one thing Grace could still spend: herself. She was tying the satchel strap when the door opened. Humphrey wheeled into the room. He looked at the satchel, then at the letter on her vanity. He had seen the messenger. He had guessed. His face was a mask of terrifying control. "You are leaving," he said. "It is the only logical calculation." Grace's voice came out flat. "Hawthorne wants to humiliate you through me. If I am not here, his words have no target. You think my reputation is so fragile that it requires you to sleep in a post house to protect it?" "I think," Grace said, her hands trembling despite her effort to still them, "that you have fought too hard to keep them from looking at you with pity. I will not be the reason they look at you with disgust." Humphrey moved the chair forward until he was only inches from her. "I could have my solicitors crush him by evening," he said. "I could buy Hawthorne's debts, seize his properties, and leave him to rot in the very ward he threatened your mother with. I could do it quietly behind closed doors, and the whispers would remain," Grace said. "They would merely whisper more carefully. Humphrey looked at her. He saw that she was trying to save him as she had saved her mother. By removing herself. By becoming the cost no one else had to pay. Something changed in his face. The fury did not vanish. It became grief. He leaned back. He did not command her to stay. "If you leave," Humphrey said slowly, "you protect my pride. But you validate their lie. You agree that you are a thing to be bought, used, and hidden away." He reached out and touched the white ribbon tied loosely around her wrist. Grace had not noticed when she had knotted it there. "If you stay," he said, "I will drive my chair into the center of that assembly. I will make them speak plainly. I will strip the perfume from their slander." His thumb brushed the ribbon once, then fell away. "But the answer to their accusation cannot come from me. It must be yours." Grace could not speak. "The carriage will be ready at 3, Humphrey said. "You will tell the driver whether it goes to Manchester or to the assembly rooms." Then he turned his chair and left her alone with the choice. At 3 o'clock, the Lancashire County Assembly was already a glittering press of silk feathers officers' coats and polite malice. The assembly rooms faced the public square, where carriages rolled in line beneath a pale, windy sky. Ladies paused on the steps to inspect one another. Gentlemen bowed. Every smile seemed to hide teeth. Grace sat inside the Penhallow carriage with her gloved hands folded in her lap. The white silk ribbon was tied around her right wrist in a neat, undeniable bow. Her mother's breath was safe at Penhallow House. The sewing-room ledger waited on her desk. Humphrey sat opposite her, silent. He did not ask which road she had chosen. The square outside answered for her. When the footman opened the carriage door, Grace stepped down into the wind. The murmurs began at once. Humphrey descended by the side ramp with practiced precision. No footman touched his chair without being asked. When he reached the stone steps, Grace walked beside him, not behind him. Together they appeared at the top of the landing. The crowd quieted. At the base of the steps stood Henry Hawthorne, speaking loudly to a circle of gentlemen. Jaquetta Thorne stood nearby, her fan fluttering like a moth over a candle. "A tragedy, really," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying with deliberate ease. "One must pity His Grace. Reduced to trading coin for companionship. A sick-bed bargain. One wonders what a woman will sell when she has no pedigree to speak of." The silence that struck the square was absolute. There it was, the poison in daylight. Humphrey did not flinch. He laid his hands flat on the wheels of his chair and pushed himself forward to the edge of the stone landing. "Mr. Hawthorne," Humphrey's voice rang over the cobbles, "you are speaking of my wife. Do not hide behind gossip. Speak plainly. Use the words you intend." Hawthorne puffed his chest. "I merely observe the truth, Your Grace. She signed the lines to save her mother from the ward. She is a bought bride." A paid companion, wrapped in ducal silk. The crowd gasped. Jaquetta smiled behind her fan. Humphrey looked at Hawthorne with eyes like winter water. He did not defend Grace's purity. He did not threaten violence. He cleared the space. Then he turned his chair slightly, opening the floor beside him. He looked at Grace. Grace stepped forward. The wind pulled at her skirts. Hundreds of faces stared up at her, waiting to see her crumble, waiting for the Duke to hide her behind his title, waiting for her shame to confirm their pleasure. Her knees wanted to weaken. She did not permit them. "I signed a settlement to save my mother's life," Grace said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried cleanly through the stunned square. "I traded my future for her breath. Yes, Mr. Hawthorne. That is the truth." Hawthorne smirked. "A confession." "A fact," Grace corrected. The word cut sharper than any cry. "But a daughter's sacrifice does not give you or anyone in this square the right to call me purchasable." She looked at him fully. For once, she did not lower her eyes before a man who had held her hunger in his hand. "You look at me and see a bargain. I look at you and see a man who preys on the sick." A murmur passed through the crowd. Grace raised her right hand. The white silk ribbon fluttered in the wind. "This ribbon tied the roses His Grace placed in my hands on the night I signed that paper. I thought it marked the price of me. I was wrong." Her voice grew steadier. "It marked the first time anyone in that room treated me as more than a debt." Humphrey went utterly still beside her. Grace turned her gaze from Hawthorne to Jacquetta, then to the ladies on the steps, the gentlemen by the railings, and the servants pretending not to listen. "I am not a project. I am not a decoration. I am not a lesson in charity." She lowered her hand. "Next week, the east wing of Penhallow House will open as a convalescent needlework room. Women who have been starved by men like you, Mr. Hawthorne, will earn a proper wage under my roof. They will not beg, and they will not be shamed." Hawthorne's smile faltered. Grace looked over the square. "My name is Grace Gresham. I am the Duchess of Penhallow, and I am not ashamed of a single day of my life." The silence that followed was profound. For one dangerous second, it did not feel like victory. It felt like judgment. A lady near the steps lowered her eyes, calculating. A gentleman beside Hawthorne shifted his weight, waiting to see which way rank would move. Jacquetta's mouth curved behind her fan, preparing to turn courage into comedy before the crowd could decide what it had witnessed. Humphrey moved. He pushed his chair forward until he was perfectly aligned with Grace. Then, in full view of the county, he reached out and took her hand. "Grace is Duchess of Penhallow," he said. "By law. By honor." He looked up at her then, and the cold armor was gone. What remained was fierce, burning warmth. "And by my choice." Grace's breath caught, not because he had saved her, because he had stood beside her while she saved herself. The square changed. Not all at once, not kindly, but unmistakably. Jacquetta's fan stilled before the words could leave her mouth. The gentleman beside Hawthorne stepped away first, then another. A matron on the steps gave Grace a small, grave bow. Conversations resumed around Hawthorne with devastating politeness, as if he had become something unpleasant on the pavement. Hawthorne's face turned ashen. Jacquetta snapped her fan shut and hurried toward her carriage. Grace stood beside Humphrey. Her hand remained in his. She squeezed once. He squeezed back. 3 weeks later, the smell of lavender and clean linen filled the east wing of Penhallow House. Mrs. Gresham sat in a cushioned chair near the tall windows, a warm blanket over her knees and a basket of folded hems beside her. Her breathing was not strong, but it was steady. That was enough to make Grace pause every morning and thank God in silence. Around the long wooden tables, 12 women from the village worked with needles and fine Belfast thread. There was quiet talk, the soft rasp of scissors, the tiny snap of thread being bitten clean. A kettle steamed near the hearth. Grace stood at the head of the room, checking a ledger. It was not a duchess's ornament. It was her work. The door opened. Humphrey wheeled himself in. Grace noticed immediately that the heavy brass threshold had been removed. The wooden frame had been widened and smoothed. He moved into the room with effortless grace. He did not interrupt the women. He nodded to them, and they nodded back, not with pity, not with alarm, but with the comfortable respect of people who knew they were safe. Humphrey gestured toward the open French doors leading to the conservatory garden. Grace closed the ledger and followed him outside. The autumn sun was bright. Beside the glass wall, a new wooden trellis had been erected. Small white climbing roses were beginning to wind their way up the slats. Humphrey stopped his chair near the trellis. "I had the threshold widened," he said quietly. "I saw. I did not ask the architect whether it was proper. I simply ordered it done." Grace, a shocking misuse of ducal authority. His mouth softened. "I am learning where authority is useful." The warmth in his voice nearly undid her. He looked toward the sewing room, where the women bent over their work in the sun. "When you signed that parchment, Grace, I gave you a suite of rooms and called you Your Grace. I treated you like a princess on a pedestal. You protected me." "I hid you," he corrected gently. Grace's smile faded. "I honored you so extravagantly because I was terrified," he said. "I knew the violence of being treated as less than whole. I knew what it was to be reduced to a body in a chair. I thought if I placed you high enough above them, they could not reduce you to a debt." He drew a quiet breath. "But a pedestal is only another kind of cage, is it not?" Grace stepped closer. For a moment, she saw him as he was, a man in a wheeled chair, proud and wounded, still learning that love did not require command. And she saw herself as she was, a woman who had survived hunger, debt, fear, and gratitude so heavy it had nearly crushed her. Neither of them had been rescued into perfection. They had simply chosen to stand where the world had told them they did not belong. Together. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out the white silk ribbon. It was slightly frayed at the edges now. She stepped to the trellis, looped the ribbon around the highest wooden rung she could reach, and tied it into a firm, permanent knot. Then she turned back to him. "I do not want a pedestal, Humphrey," she said softly. "I do not want to be above you." She came to stand before his chair. "I want a place exactly beside you." Humphrey reached for both of her hands. This time she gave them without fear of debt. He was a man in a wheeled chair. She was a woman who had worked for her survival. Neither was perfect. Neither was unbroken. But as he drew her gently forward, and as she leaned down to meet his mouth beneath the young white roses, Grace understood the truth at last. He had not treated her like a princess because she was fragile. He had treated her with reverence until she remembered she was free.